What happens when one of the world's most beloved royals sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to find himself face-to-face with a host determined to tear him down? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry's attempt at candid conversation turns into television's most explosive confrontation of the year. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement, cameras rolling as the familiar theme music played. Prince Harry, looking composed in a navy suit, walked onto the stage with his characteristic warm smile, waving to the enthusiastic crowd. The applause was thunderous, lasting nearly 30 seconds as America's fascination with the Duke of Sussex was on full display. Jimmy Kimmel emerged from behind his desk with what appeared to be his usual grin, but those who know his tells could see something different in his eyes. There was a sharpness there, a predatory gleam that suggested this wouldn't be the light-hearted celebrity chat the audience was expecting. "Your Royal Highness," Kimmel said with exaggerated formality as they shook hands. "Or should I say, just Harry now?" The comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from the audience, but Harry handled it with grace, settling into the guest chair with practiced ease. "Just Harry works perfectly fine," the prince replied, his British accent cutting through the studio's tension. "Though I have to say, Jimmy, your show's security is quite impressive. Almost felt like I was back at the palace." Kimmel's smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, we have to be careful these days. You never know who might be recording conversations or writing tell-all books about their experiences here." The barb was subtle, but unmistakable. Harry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. "I suppose transparency can be uncomfortable for some people." "Oh, I'm all for transparency," Kimmel shot back, leaning forward in his chair. "In fact, let's be transparent right now. You're here promoting your latest venture. But let's talk about what really brought you to America. Was it freedom, or was it the freedom to cash in on your royal connections?" The studio fell silent. This wasn't the playful banter audiences were used to. Harry's media training kicked in as he deflected with humor. "Well, Jimmy, I'd say it was more about finding a place where I could raise my family without having photographers, camping outside my son's school. But I suppose that's hard to understand when you make your living putting people in uncomfortable situations for entertainment." The tension in the room was palpable now. Kimmel's producers were undoubtedly scrambling behind the scenes, unsure whether to intervene or let the drama unfold. The host pressed on, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "Speaking of uncomfortable situations, let's talk about your relationship with your family. You've been quite vocal about your grievances. Some might say you've made a career out of complaining about being born into privilege." Harry's composure cracked slightly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "That's an interesting perspective from someone who's made millions mocking celebrities and politicians from behind a desk. At least when I speak about my experiences, I'm speaking my truth, not performing for laughs at others' expense." "Your truth," Kimmel repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's convenient, isn't it? When the facts don't align with your narrative, you just call it your truth." Must be nice to have that luxury. The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Harry leaned forward, his voice steady but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight thinking we could have a genuine conversation. But it's clear you're more interested in cheap shots than actual dialogue." Kimmel's mask was slipping now, his professional demeanor giving way to something uglier. "Cheap shots? That's rich coming from someone who threw his own family under the bus for a Netflix payday? Tell me, Harry, what's it like knowing that every time you open your mouth about your family, another check gets deposited in your account?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Harry's face had gone pale, but his eyes were blazing with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Don't I? Kimmel pressed, sensing blood in the water. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've turned family dysfunction into a brand. First the Oprah interview, then the documentary, the book, and now whatever this latest project is. How many times can you sell the same sob story? Harry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The movement was so sudden that several audience members gasped. That's enough, but Kimmel wasn't done. He stood as well, his voice rising. Oh, now you want to leave. That's your solution to everything, isn't it? When things get difficult, you just walk away. From your military duties, from your royal responsibilities, from your family. The words hit like physical blows. Harry's hands were shaking now. Whether from anger or hurt, it was impossible to tell. You don't know anything about my military service or my responsibilities. You sit here night after night, making jokes about people's lives, their pain, their struggles, and you think that gives you the right to judge me? The confrontation was escalating beyond anything the show had ever seen. Kimmel, emboldened by what he perceived as Harry's vulnerability, doubled down on his attack. I know you quit, he said coldly. I know you abandoned your duties and your family the moment things got tough. And now you want America to feel sorry for you? To buy your books and watch your shows so you can afford your mansion in Montecito? Harry's voice was barely controlled now, each word deliberate and sharp. You want to talk about quitting? Let's talk about how you've turned late-night television into a platform for bullying and character assassination. At least when I left my role, I did it with dignity. The insult struck home. Kimmel's face flushed red, his professional facade completely abandoned now. Dignity? You call airing your family's private business to the world dignified? You call turning your mother's death into content dignified? The mention of Princess Diana was the line that should never have been crossed. The studio gasped collectively, and Harry's face went white with rage. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually strike the host. Instead, his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent studio. How dare you? But as the two men faced off, neither backing down, it became clear that this confrontation was far from over. The real explosion was yet to come, and what happened next would change late-night television forever. The silence in the studio was deafening as Harry and Kimmel stared each other down, the host's cruel words about Princess Diana still echoing in the air. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming the most uncomfortable moment in late-night television history. Security personnel had moved closer to the stage, unsure whether to intervene or let the unprecedented drama unfold. Harry's breathing was visible now, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to contain his fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of decades of pain and frustration. You just made the biggest mistake of your career. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he had crossed a line even he shouldn't have crossed, attempted to regain some composure. Look, Harry, I'm just doing my job here. This is what late-night television is about, asking the tough questions, holding people accountable. Accountable? Harry's voice cracked with emotion. You think exploiting a son's grief over his mother's death is accountability? You think turning tragedy into a punchline is journalism? The audience was frozen in their seats, many visibly uncomfortable with the direction the interview had taken. Some were pulling out their phones, already recording. What they sensed would become viral content within hours. Kimmel's producers were frantically gesturing from the wings, trying to signal for a commercial break, but the host ignored them completely. He was too deep into the confrontation now, his ego preventing him from backing down. I'm not exploiting anything. I'm pointing out the hypocrisy of someone who claims to want privacy while simultaneously selling their story to the highest bidder. Privacy? Harry laughed bitterly. You want to talk about privacy? My mother died because people like you couldn't respect her privacy. She was hunted, stalked, and ultimately killed by people who treated her life like entertainment. And here, you are 30 years later doing the exact same thing. The comparison hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His face went pale as he realized the parallel Harry was drawing. "That's not... I'm not..." "You're not what?" Harry pressed, stepping closer to the host's desk. "You're not part of the same machine that destroyed my family? You're not feeding the same appetite for scandal and humiliation that killed my mother?" Kimmel's voice rose defensively. "I'm a comedian, not a paparazzi photographer. There's a difference." "Is there?" Harry's voice was gaining strength now, his royal bearing returning as he found his footing in the argument. "Because from where I stand, you're both parasites feeding off other people's pain. At least the photographers were honest about what they were doing." The insult stung, and Kimmel's carefully constructed persona finally cracked completely. "Parasite? You want to talk about parasites? You lived off the British taxpayers for decades, contributing nothing but ribbon cuttings and photo ops. At least I earned my money." "Earned it?" Harry shot back. "By mocking grieving families? By turning personal tragedy into comedy bits? By bullying guests on your show when they don't dance to your tune?" The back and forth was becoming more heated by the second, with neither man willing to back down. The studio audience was captivated by the raw emotion on display, many of them filming despite attempts by security to stop them. Kimmel, sensing he was losing control of the situation, decided to go for what he thought would be the killing blow. "You know what the real tragedy is, Harry? Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become. She died protecting you from the spotlight, and you've turned around and sold your story to anyone willing to pay." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Harry went completely still, his face a mask of controlled rage. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You don't get to speak for my mother. You don't get to tell me what she would think. You know nothing about her, nothing about what she stood for, nothing about what she died for. I know she wouldn't want her son airing the royal family's dirty laundry on television," Kimmel pressed, seemingly oblivious to the danger he was courting. "She died because of people like you." Harry exploded, his composure finally shattering completely. "She died because of the lies, the harassment, the constant invasion of privacy. And you have the audacity to sit there and judge me for trying to tell the truth?" The royal was on his feet now, his voice echoing through the stunned studio. Kimmel, finally sensing he might have pushed too far, tried to regain control. "Harry, let's just calm down here." "Calm down?" Harry's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You want me to calm down after you've spent the last 20 minutes attacking everything I care about? After you've mocked my family, my service, my mother's memory?" The mention of his military service seemed to trigger something else in Harry. His posture straightened, and for a moment, the trained soldier was visible beneath the grieving sun. "You know what really gets me, Jimmy? You sit here in your comfortable studio, making jokes about people who've actually served, who've actually sacrificed something for their country. What have you ever sacrificed? What have you ever risked?" Kimmel's attempt at a comeback was weak. "I've built a career. I've entertained millions of people." "You've built a career on the backs of other people's misery," Harry cut him off. "You've made millions by punching down, by attacking people when they're vulnerable, by turning pain into profit. And you have the nerve to question my integrity?" The confrontation was reaching a fever pitch now, with both men's voices raised, and the studio audience completely silent except for the sound of dozens of phones recording every word. The producers had given up trying to cut to commercial, realizing they were witnessing television history in the making. Kimmel, his face red with anger and embarrassment, made one final desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. "At least I'm honest about what I do. I don't pretend to be something I'm not. You want to be seen as this champion of mental health and privacy, but you're just another celebrity cashing in on your trauma." The accusation was the final straw. Harry's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the studio. "You want to see trauma, Jimmy? You want to see what it's really like to lose everything, to have your life destroyed by people who think entertainment is more important than human decency? He stepped closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now dominating the space. I've seen friends die in Afghanistan. I've held dying soldiers in my arms while people like you made jokes about the war from the safety of your studio. I've watched my family torn apart by the same media machine that killed my mother. And you think you can sit there and lecture me about cashing in on trauma? The raw emotion in Harry's voice was palpable, and even Kimmel seemed to realize he had pushed far, beyond any reasonable boundary. But the damage was done, and the confrontation had reached a point of no return. As the two men faced each other across the desk, the tension in the studio was unbearable. What happened next would determine not just the fate of this particular interview, but the future of both men's careers. The moment stretched like an eternity, both men locked in a battle of wills that had transcended any semblance of a normal television interview. The studio lights seemed brighter, the silence more profound, as if the entire world was holding its breath waiting for what would happen next. Harry's eyes never left Kimmel's face as he spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy? When I make a mistake, when I hurt someone, I take responsibility for it. I acknowledge the damage I've caused and I try to make it right. But you hide behind comedy, behind the excuse that it's just entertainment. Kimmel's jaw was clenched tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. I don't need to justify my career to you or anyone else. Your career? Harry's laugh was cold and humorless. Is that what you call this systematic destruction of people's dignity? Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like legalized bullying with a laugh track. The audience was completely captivated now, many of them recording on their phones despite the clear disapproval from security. They knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Harry continued, his voice gaining momentum as years of frustration poured out. You sit here night after night, making jokes about people's mental health struggles, their family problems, their personal tragedies, and then you wonder why society has become so cruel, so disconnected from basic human empathy. That's not what I do, Kimmel protested weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Harry challenged. Because I've seen the clips, Jimmy. I've seen you mock people for their appearance, their accents, their struggles with addiction. I've seen you turn vulnerable moments into punchlines. And tonight, you've shown your true colors by attacking a grieving son over his dead mother. The words hit Kimmel like physical blows. His face was flushed red now, sweat visible on his forehead under the studio lights. You're taking this too seriously. This is comedy. This is cruelty disguised as entertainment. Harry cut him off sharply. And the fact that you can't see the difference is exactly the problem. Kimmel, desperate to regain some semblance of control, stood up from behind his desk. You came on my show, Harry. You knew what this was. You can't come into my house and then complain about the rules. Your house? Harry's voice was incredulous. This isn't your house, Jimmy. This is a public platform that you've been entrusted with, and you've turned it into a weapon to attack people who can't fight back. The confrontation had reached its peak, with both men now standing facing each other across the narrow space that separated the guest chair from the host's desk. The studio audience was completely silent, mesmerized by the raw emotion on display. Harry's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the studio. You want to know what my mother would think, Jimmy? She'd be disgusted. Not by me, but by people like you who profit from pain, who turn human suffering into content, who forget that behind every story, there's a real person with real feelings. Kimmel's face went pale. For the first time in the entire confrontation, he seemed to realize the gravity of what he had done. Harry, No. Harry held up his hand, his voice final. You've said enough. More than enough. He turned toward the audience, his bearing once again regal, despite the emotional turmoil of the past 30 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, I came here tonight hoping to have a conversation about important issues, about mental health, about service, about the things that matter. Instead, I've been subjected to a character assassination by someone who mistakes cruelty for comedy. The audience was spellbound as Harry continued, his voice carrying the authority of his royal upbringing. This is exactly why my wife and I stepped away from public life in Britain, not because we couldn't handle criticism, but because we refused to participate in a system that rewards this kind of behavior. Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Harry, please, let's just what? Harry turned back to face him, his eyes blazing. Let's just pretend this didn't happen? Let's just laugh it off and move on? That's exactly the problem, Jimmy. There are no consequences for people like you. You can destroy someone's reputation, mock their pain, attack their family, and then just move on to the next victim. The prince began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. But not tonight. Tonight, there are consequences. As he unclipped the small device and placed it on the chair, the sound of his voice became more distant but somehow more powerful. You see, Jimmy, you made a fundamental mistake tonight. You assumed that because I've been open about my struggles, because I've been vulnerable about my pain, that made me weak. But vulnerability isn't weakness. It's strength. And standing up to bullies like you? That's what real courage looks like. Kimmel was frozen behind his desk, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to find words to respond to the devastating critique. Harry straightened his jacket and looked directly into the main camera. To everyone watching at home, this is what happens when we mistake cruelty for entertainment, when we reward people for tearing others down instead of building them up. This is the result of a culture that values clicks over compassion, ratings over basic human decency. He paused, his next words delivered with the weight of absolute conviction. My mother died because people couldn't see past the entertainment value of her pain. I won't let that happen again. Not to me, not to my family, and not on my watch. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Harry began walking toward the stage exit, but stopped and turned back one final time. One last thing, Jimmy, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent studio. You asked me earlier what my mother would think of me. Well, I know exactly what she'd think. She'd be proud that her son finally learned to walk away from people who mistake kindness for weakness, who confuse vulnerability with opportunity. His final words were delivered with devastating precision. She'd be proud that I finally learned to recognize the difference between those who deserve my time and those who don't. With that, Prince Harry turned and walked off the stage with the same dignity he'd entered with, leaving behind a stunned studio audience and a host who sat frozen in his chair, the magnitude of what had just transpired slowly sinking in. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Kimmel's shocked expression and the complete silence of an audience that had just witnessed one of the most dramatic confrontations in television history. When the show finally cut to commercial, the damage was already done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media platforms faster than wildfire. The hashtag #ChowKimmelMeltdown began trending immediately, with viewers expressing their shock and disgust at the host's behavior. The overwhelming sentiment was clear. Jimmy Kimmel had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and Prince Harry had emerged as the clear victor in a battle that was about much more than just a late-night interview. The confrontation was over, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Harry had walked away with his dignity intact, while Kimmel was left to face the consequences of his actions. It was a powerful reminder that in the age of social media and instant accountability, there are still some boundaries that cannot be crossed without serious repercussions.